Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. Today in the economy show, we have a lot to talk about. We're gonna essentially break it up into our 5 different segments. The first one is going to look at high frequency data, what's happening in the world, where is the vaccine look, what is happening with COVID. And then we're going to shift to inflation. What are inflation expectations? What's happening with the US dollar? Where are things going to go overall? Then we're going to shift to US economic data, again, looking at small businesses. Are they the canary in the coal mine, kind of showing what's going to happen? Then we're going to do a European update, looking at European economic data and the euro as we head into the ECB meeting on Thursday, or based on when this is released today. So we're going to have a lot to talk about next week. And then we're going to look at Asian data, and Asian data in the way of we have way more stimulus coming, specifically from Japan, South Korea, and then looking at what is happening with Chinese exports, imports, and what does that mean for just the world in general as we look at overall movements of goods. So before we get into this, please just a reminder, like, share, subscribe. We appreciate your support. And then we do have our end of year report available. So please reach out for samples and for the table of contents, because we do cover, specific to this show, we do cover China in great detail. We're looking at all of this economic data as a backdrop to NGLs, oil, natural gas, and kind of what things are going to look like into 2021. So getting right into, for those that watch the EIA show, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because, again, it's very self-evident that the problems remain. And the reason is, when we look at just the general slowdown, Italy continues to shift lower. France has recovered but flattened out. You can look at the U.S. has continued to kind of drift down, but we're holding now at these levels. But the general trend is this movement and this decline into year end. And that's why, when we look at, and as we talk about with GDP, as we talk about with PMIs, as we get towards the end of the year, it's going to be really hard to say, it's January, everything back to normal. And that's why there's gonna be this pivot point of, when do we really start to see things normalize? Is it January? Is it February? Is it March? Based on the way the market is pricing everything, it's going to happen Jan 1, and we'll never look back. But when we look at just some of these uncertainties, this is what we're looking at to see where are we starting to see these pivots. Now, one of the reasons why we remain concerned on a global level is because look at the advanced economies versus everyone else. So the advanced economies are continuing to drift down, and they're big buyers of emerging markets, and this is excluding China. So, and then later on in the show, we're going to talk about the increase in dollar-denominated debt, the increase in debt at the emerging market level, and why that's going to be a hindrance for total recovery. So they have maintained fairly well. You can see they've been able to hold 83 to 85%. But as the advanced economies continue to drift down, that's going to act as that draw to the downside, and it may not shift it all the way down, but again, it's going to act as an anchor and keep it from really rallying. While China has been able to maintain their supply-driven recovery, but it's really not a demand-driven recovery, and that's what I think some of the nuances that we were going to touch on in the last segment. And looking at just emerging markets overall, you can see that it's a tale of two cities with, Indonesia, Argentina, Russia, all of these shifting down, having that pressure to the downside. And it's really driven based on increase in COVID cases, people trying to do less, but we're getting this consolidation around this 85, 87% as we do get some normalization, and it is supportive. India is the one to watch as well, because India, and this is why we talk about India so much, because it is an oil demand driver, but at the same time, they're experiencing inflation fears. They're limited for the amount they continue to ease their economy, which is going to limit the amount that they're going to be able to stimulate, which is going to keep them fairly stagnant, which is, I think, an overarching problem when we're seeing about how quickly can we normalize. And that's why I think it's an important one to look at as we head not only into year end, but also into next year. Now, just to take an example, because we could do this for every single country, but when we look at South Korea, so South Korea has seen a big increase in cases. And it's important to appreciate what does that mean and how does that impact, because when we look at South Korea, it's a good way to indicate how other countries around them would react to something similar. So the government stringency index is starting to go higher. It's not there yet, but you're seeing that people are already naturally adjusting, as we've been talking about with consumer shifts. We've seen that with transportation. Expressway traffic is down, again, coming full circle back to demand. Expressway traffic, retail, recreation visits, movie attendance, all of these things are shifting to the downside as people are trying to limit their exposures to that increase in cases. Now, what about vaccines? Where do we go with vaccines? Pfizer is now approved in the UK. We've started to see some increase in vaccinations. People who who have some form of anaphylactic shock or have some sort of propensity or carry around an EpiPen have had some severe reactions, and there has been a push to keep them from getting the vaccine. Again, that's a smaller part of the population, but we're going to start to learn more and more as more people get inoculated. And okay, well, who's sensitive to this? Who's not? Because when you're testing against 40,000 people, it's going to be very hard to find all walks of life and the different intricacies that the body goes through. So we're going to have to adjust and make those adjustments over, as we learn more. Again, Pfizer, in terms of the transportation, we're going to go into more depth in our report coming out on Friday, looking at, okay, well, how is it shipping? Who's doing it? But Moderna should get some approvals on Thursday. We should get AstraZeneca had to go back to the drawing board, and they had to do testing again because there were some issues with their data sets. And then you can see the other two remain in their trial dates. So obviously Pfizer remains the front and center, and we're starting to get some data back from the UK with the first inoculations happening. The problem is, again, Pfizer had to cut their shipments for 2020, and the expectations coming into U.S. states was over-exaggerated. Again, whether they were using old federal guidelines or not, it's who knows at this point. But there was going to be New York, Nevada, places that were expecting X amount are going to get Y amount, which means that there's just going to be less to go around. So there's going to be a little bit of a slowdown in terms of moving it through the system. Now, looking at the ones that we've seen, so these are the ones in China and in Russia, and you can see that they got early approval. Most of them are being, like the Sinovac one is much similar to your previous normal vaccine, where they're just taking a COVID-19 virus, they're essentially killing it and then introducing the dead virus to your system. The others are using something similar to what we've seen with like the CanSino one is very similar to what let's give someone cowpox instead of smallpox, because it'll still, so they're giving the cold virus to deliver the genetic payload, which is a little bit of a different play. So they're taking your normal cold, and instead of using that to trigger a response, they're using the cold as a means of delivering the new genetic code to defeat coronavirus. So again, a lot of these got early approval. They've been used either in clinical trials and/or the military. So again, we're still waiting to hear more on some of those data points. Now, we talked about debt and sustainability. I thought this was a great report. The link is below. I would recommend reading it's only a couple pages, but it really does a good job of looking at low inflation risk, high debt, low inflation, low debt, high inflation, low debt, and high debt, high inflation. And this is why we're so concerned about India, because India is in a position where they are experiencing high inflation and high debt. So the question is, how much can they continue to stimulate? Because we have Modi looking to try to resurrect the industrial side. We're seeing some changes in not only taxes, but also some tariffs and other means to simplify and to try to spark some of this recovery. So there's going to be a lot of fear, and that top quadrant is the one to watch. Now, high inflation risk, there's ways to mitigate that, but the low debt level is an important one, because the low debt, I think, is going to be the one to want to get involved in, like Malaysia, Vietnam are countries that we've always been interested in on the C6 side. And we think that there's a lot of opportunity. So again, it comes into that low debt, low inflation risk, which is key. You don't want to drift higher, high debt while low inflation is key, because they either have pegged to currencies, they have forwards where they're trying to manage, specifically Brazil. You still don't want high debt. So again, this is also going to limit the amount that you can issue emerging market debt in order to try to stimulate the economy, again, causing some issues overall. So then when we look at debt maturity structures, remember last week and the week before, we talked about government debt maturities really accelerating in 2021. And Brazil is obviously the biggest component of that. So it's going to be, at this point, given where spreads are, it's going to be easy to roll that. And it should be at a fairly comfortable interest rate. It's just the question is how normal or how low can rates stay if the central bank is limited to the amount that they can actually try to manage some of those rates, which we'll talk about with the ECB in a moment. But that's why when we look at, okay, well, where is inflation going to be and where do we have the mixture? And this is going to be a chart to watch as we start to see some of these rollovers and as we start to see some of this debt get converted or try to get rolled, like Thailand should be able to do this fairly easy given where rates are currently and how there's been a propensity to want to invest in emerging markets as the dollar has come under pressure, which has pushed capital into the emerging side. So, but as we look at inflation overall and we look at just, where are the expectations, and this is now shifting a bit to the US, because when we look at the CPI expectations, but then when we look at the actual recent price changes, you can see a marked shift in terms of where those things are. So CPI came down, but you're getting a big push through in price increases. And as we've talked about with the level of transportation, with what's happening in the world today, and you can see that typically the NFIB is a leading indicator for where the CPI goes, and it can outpace for an extended period of time. But this is a point where we will see that pass through, and we will start to see some of those numbers turn around, and this will drive us much closer. Now, does it have to go all the way up to, let's call it this 2.7%? No. That doesn't have to be the case, but again, it's something where we're seeing inflation come through the market in ever greater and greater detail. So here, when we look at central banks, and again, speaking of easing, so the Fed is expected to add 120 billion, the BOC 200 million, the ECB 118 billion, the BOJ 25.7 billion, the BOE 18.3 billion. There is a lot of stimulus coming into the market. Now, right now, you can say that, okay, well, what is happening? We're not seeing this inflation, and this is monthly. Like, these are monthly purchases, and to put it into context, okay, well, the numbers are big, but okay, well, what percentage of the balance sheet is that? For the Fed, it's 1.7%. So every month they're going to purchase 1.7% of their balance sheet. If we're in such a great position, if the market is looking past this and we're pricing in growth, well, then why do we need such levels? Like, liquidity isn't an issue at the banking side. No one is looking at these banks and saying, wow, they're short liquidity. Or are they? And they're trying to hide it in different ways. And there is a big problem with just this constant mantra of, oh, bad economic data, it doesn't matter, we get stimulus. Good economic data, it doesn't matter, we get stimulus. Well, if it's really bad data, we're going to get fiscal and monetary stimulus. And if we don't get fiscal, well, we still have monetary. Again, these are the risks that we continue to pump into the market and continue to put pressure on just what is real data actually mean. Like, I sit here and I try to show data points that are interesting and that should be leading indicators, and I try to do a balance of here's some good stuff, here's some bad stuff, here's some mixed stuff, and this was what we could have going forward. But with levels like this, it just goes up. And that's where it gets frustrating. So here, when we look at, the G10 central bank expected, this is the percentage of annual GDP that is going to be purchased across the different banks. So every month, the Fed is going to purchase 60 basis points of GDP. So again, this is why I struggle when we look at GDP. And we played this exercise where we essentially said, okay, well, let's take GDP, let's take out inflation, let's take it from nominal to real, and how much actual growth did we have over the last 10 years? It's like, okay, well, that's a number that is not overly exciting, but now let's take it to a next level. Let's take the government, the G, out of the GDP calculation. And it's still, the government and the Fed and the monetary and fiscal side have continued to prop up an economy, and we'll go through in more depth on the BOJ, who is kind of the godfather of all of this, as they've been doing it since the 90s. And the question, like, there needs to be this rejuvenation. There needs to be this normalization. But again, the market's at all-time highs, or now at least off all-time highs. But as some of this data continues to kind of conflict, but we continue to see the stimulus coming through, which is why emerging markets, central banks are pausing their rate cutting cycle, because it's a mixture of, because they're already starting to do better, as we talked about with the high frequency data points. But at the same time, there's a certain amount of fear of, well, if I keep cutting, what are my interest rates going to be? If I keep cutting, what's my inflation expectations going to be? And that's why we're starting to see less activity and even some reversals of some of the movements, just because there's some fear with, okay, well, let's make sure that inflation doesn't start to increase. Let's make sure that, things don't start to overheat, because in India, things are really starting to get hot, which is going to be a concern as we go forward. Now, when we look at the Fed, we've shown this before. The Fed continues to be the largest buyer of treasuries versus the foreign side. So if you need dollars in the international market, sell your treasuries, then the central bank will buy it. So again, this is just also a means of pushing dollars into the international market and trying to help some of those FX reserves and some of those currencies abroad. But a big chunk of debt is also owned by the ECB, and there's a rising call for the ECB to just forgive the debt, just get rid of it, just say, yeah, it's okay, guys, we're good. And again, it comes down to, what are the fears behind that? What are the repercussions? Where right now it feels as though there's none, because the euro is trading at $1.2064, and so everything is fine. But again, it's just always a matter of, what is the risk here? Because you can see with Germany, France, Italy, Spain, what they currently have, and then obviously the debt holders of what the others are. And does this mean that Italy and all these other countries can issue a ton of debt, hope the ECB buys it and then forgives it? But again, we're going to have a very big meeting today in the ECB this morning in terms of what can we expect next. And that's why I think this is a kind of a good pivot, as to, now that we talked about the ECB and we'll talk about the euro in a little bit, let's pivot to the dollar and look at, okay, well, what's happened with USD and what does that mean for inflation expectations, not only in the US, but also abroad?